Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves standing in the hushed streets of ancient Rome beneath a sky painted by the red and gold glare of fire. The smell of smoke chokes the air, ash drifts like snow, and every breath tastes of charcoal and panic. It is not a cheerful scene unless you are a pyromaniac, in which case you probably will not survive this bedtime story anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are at it, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The night is alive with confusion. Flames climb higher than the marble columns of the Curia, the Senate House whose walls hold the most guarded papers in the empire. Sparks wheel upward like frantic stars and tiles pop from the roof with the sound of sling stones. Witnesses press against one another in the forum, the heat pushing them back several meters, several feet with every gust. Scrolls that chart victories and scandals curl into blackened spirals, then collapse into flakes that float away like dark snow. Senators in white togas stumble through the smoke with soot-streaked faces, clutching whatever bundles they can carry, sometimes records, sometimes account books, and in one memorable case, a gilded birdcage with a protesting parrot inside. The crowd does what crowds do, stare, point and whisper, as if the building itself can hear them. Rome knows fire. Even in the age of marble veneers, much of the city is wood plaster and good intentions. Lamps burn oil kitchens, hiss with braziers, and a stray ember can turn a quiet street into a glowing corridor in the time it takes to shout for a bucket. Still, this blaze feels different. The flames roar with a steady, hungry voice, as if the building exhaled and finally allowed the fire it had been holding back all day to spill into the open. Mainstream historians agree that the Curia Julia, rebuilt and refurbished more than once, held the central archive spaces where records, decrees and sensitive reports were stored. The city's firefighting force, the vigils founded under Augustus, scrambles to respond. They form bucket lines, drag hand pumps and heave soaked cloths onto doorways. Yet the embers drift across the open space and ignite timbers faster than the vigils can douse them. Listen to the soundscape. Bronze hinges shriek, beams crack, and a chorus of shouts echoes from every angle. Heat distorts the air, making columns ripple like reeds. A ladder creaks and then folds, sending two men tumbling into a heap. Someone yells to break open a side door, someone else screams to keep it shut to starve the flames. The logic changes every heartbeat. A chest of records, its wood already blistering, requires 4 men to shift, each man bowing under a load that feels heavier by the step. If the chest contains around 40 kilograms, about 88 pounds of documents, the effort is a punishing dance. 2 steps forward, 1 stumble sideways, and then a lurch toward the nearest patch of open ground. Even the stone seems to glow. If you could have measured the air at the centre of the blaze, you might guess it surges past 400 degrees Celsius, about 752 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to make iron nails lose their temper and to turn parchment into bitter black curls almost the instant a spark lands. The mystery breathes in the gaps between the flames. These halls do not only house mundane tax receipts and minutes of dull debates. They are said to hold the forbidden archive records sealed by decree testimonies gathered behind closed doors and prophecies written with more confidence than caution. Some claim there are papyrus rolls detailing secret treaties with kings at the empire's edges, and letters that should never see daylight because they name conspirators who wear senators' shoes. Historians still argue whether such a forbidden reserve truly exists as a distinct chamber, or whether it is merely a later rumour piled on top of an already dramatic night. But the Roman habit of classification and record-keeping is well known, and the Senate did maintain repositories for sensitive decrees. That much is safe ground beneath our feet. A quirky detail survives in later chatter. A slave reportedly carried out a heavy amphora not of wine, but of lamp oil, proudly saving his master's investment, while the master shouted to save the ledgers first. Another story has a parrot a gift from the east shrieking "Veto, veto" as its cage is hustled through the smoke, which is either tragic or perfect satire depending on your appetite for gallows humour. The vigiles, for their part, work with the tools they have. Their hand pumps spit narrow streams. Their hooks tear away burning shutters to carve fire breaks. Buckets slosh water arcs, steam hisses. Nearby, fountains and cisterns are tapped. An amphora holds around 26 litres, about 7 gallons, and a small cart might haul 4 or 5, but the fire gulps more liquid than the bucket lines can feed. The distance from fountain to door, perhaps 100 metres, about 328 feet, becomes a pilgrimage measured in footsteps' heat and the grit between one's teeth. Dawn approaches blue and ash grey. The Senate House stands like a hollowed ribcage, its roof fallen inward, its doorways clogged with half-burned debris. Senators cough into their sleeves. A clerk tries to read a surviving tablet only to discover that the beeswax has puddled words drifting like lost boats. Here lies the blank space history hates what exactly has been destroyed. One man mutters that he saw guards removing bundles before the fire took hold. Another swears that a wagon rolled away through a side gate long before the first flames were visible at the roofline. Perhaps they pulled out payrolls, perhaps treaties, perhaps personal papers no one wants discussed. Or perhaps they pulled out nothing but chairs and wishful thinking. In smoke, everyone's memory becomes an artist. A mainstream fact anchors us in the swirl. Rome did maintain fire brigades and night watchmen, the vigils, with cohorts stationed across the city to patrol, prevent and fight fires, and to keep order after sunset. The existence of organised firefighting in Rome is not in dispute, even if their effectiveness on a night like this is painfully limited. Their presence explains the disciplined lines, the shouted orders, the frantic but structured response we can almost hear across the centuries. Yet on this night, discipline collides with physics. If the blaze leaps from room to room at a pace of several meters, several feet each minute, the men are always behind, chasing a red horizon that keeps stepping away. Whispers race through taverns by afternoon. Some citizens ascribe the disaster to divine displeasure, Jupiter angry at senatorial arrogance or Vesta offended by negligence. Others mutter a simpler story, careless lamps, tired scribes, and a gusty wind. There are, of course, political readings. Who benefits if records vanish? A nervous senator whose name appears in an inquiry, an ambitious rival who prefers his opponent's financial entanglements to melt into anonymity, or a cautious emperor who likes his past to be as tidy as his present. The questions rise like sparks and drift on, unanswerable yet irresistible. A second joke makes the rounds. If only Rome paved its streets with water instead of stones, we would have saved the paperwork and the patricians both. As evening returns, the smell of wet ash settles over the forum. Children pick at charcoal, pretending to be heroes with blackened spears. A woman sells cups of watered wine to hoarse-voiced onlookers. Somewhere a clerk counts, then stops because counting ruined records is like tallying ghosts. The city contracts and expands around its loss, unsure whether to treat it as accident, omen, or opportunity. What remains are rumours, fragments, and the ache of a space where certainty used to live. The forbidden archive, whatever precisely it contained, has been licked by fire. The truth hides in pockets of shadow, or else it has flown upward with the sparks and thinned into the sky. Tonight Rome learns an old lesson again: memory is a building that can burn. And for us drowsy travellers listening centuries later, the embers still glow, with questions that no bucket line can put out. The flames of the Senate House still smoulder, but already the whispers move faster than the smoke. Every corner of Rome, from the taverns where bricklayers sip sour wine to the marble halls, where senators pace with furrowed brows, is alive with the same hushed question: what exactly was in those archives? The answer, of course, depends on who you ask, and perhaps on who wants you to believe their version. Ordinary citizens imagine treasure lists, gold reserves hidden in temples, warehouses stocked with olive oil, the secret inventories of amphorae measured in thousands of litres, thousands of quarts that keep the empire's bellies full. Others picture scrolls filled with sordid gossip, which senator bribed, which judge, which general stole half the grain supply, which noblewoman entertained half the guard in her villa. But the darker, more enduring rumour is that these archives contained the forbidden texts, records too sensitive, too dangerous, or too inconvenient for the people of Rome to see. Mainstream historians do acknowledge that Rome maintained a complex system of record-keeping. Decrees of the Senate were written on tablets, laws copied into ledgers, and important treaties stored carefully. Yet there is debate over how much of this secret material existed in one place. Some argue the term forbidden archive is a later invention, a romantic exaggeration layered on by writers who loved a mystery. Historians still argue whether the Romans really set aside a chamber specifically for hidden prophecies and incriminating letters, or whether sensitive scrolls were simply locked in cabinets within the ordinary archive. The truth lies somewhere between bureaucratic necessity and whispered legend. Let us imagine, though, what the Romans believed was locked away. One fringe story passed down in scraps of later writing insists that among the forbidden scrolls was a set of Sibylline prophecies. Those mysterious verses purchased by an early king of Rome from a strange old woman who demanded an outrageous price. The originals, of course, were supposedly destroyed long before, yet every generation seems to believe new ones had surfaced. Could such prophecies have been tucked into the Senate's chambers, consulted only in times of crisis? The idea that senators kept an emergency drawer of apocalyptic poetry may sound absurd, yet it fits Rome's character, practical enough to build aqueducts, but superstitious enough to scatter salt if someone sneezed at the wrong moment. Another possibility concerns treaties and correspondence. Rome's dealings with neighbouring powers were not always glorious. Not every treaty ended in triumph. Some were humiliating concessions forced by stronger enemies. If such documents remained in the archive, they would serve as permanent reminders of Rome's moments of weakness. Imagine the horror of a proud senator discovering his grandfather's signature beneath the words, "Rome yields hostages to Carthage," or worse, "Rome pays 1,000 talents of silver." For reference, 1 talent could weigh more than 30 kilograms, about 66 pounds, so 1,000 talents would equal 30,000 kilograms, about 66,000 pounds of silver. That is not just a payment, it is a mountain of humiliation. Better for such records to be forgotten unless you happen to be the one embarrassed by them. There are also tales of personal confessions. Some whisper that senators under investigation were required to leave written statements sealed and stored until a trial concluded. If true, those confessions would be dynamite in political hands. One signature, one list of co-conspirators, one panicked admission written under pressure. Such a document could topple reputations or confirm suspicions. The thought of these scrolls feeding the flames thrills conspiracy theorists. Did guilty men breathe easier as the smoke rose, or did they tremble unsure whether their secrets had burned or been stolen? Quirky tidbits pepper the gossip. One tale claims that recipes for exotic ointments, including a cosmetic paste mixed with crocodile dung, were locked in the same cabinets as military reports. Another insists there were anatomical sketches smuggled from Alexandria, showing experiments that made even hardened physicians blanch. A drunk patron in a Subura tavern swears that scrolls describing the breeding of giant war chickens, yes chickens, were hidden in the archive. Was he joking? Almost certainly. But the fact that Romans could believe such oddities speaks volumes about how shadowy the archive's reputation had become. Picture the conversations at the baths in the days after the fire. Men in steaming pools speculate with the same energy they used to argue about chariot teams. One insists that the lost scrolls included proof that Julius Caesar secretly wanted to be worshipped as a god, decades before he admitted it. Another argues that records of senators plotting against Augustus were burned deliberately with Augustus's blessing. The steam rises, voices echo, and the truth remains as slippery as the oil on their skin. Here too is where politics sharpens the whispers into weapons. If an enemy falls from favour, someone might murmur, perhaps his name was in those forbidden records. If a rival grows too bold, another might hint, he only struts because the evidence against him turned to ash. The very absence of documents becomes a tool, a void into which suspicion can be poured, and that in some ways is more powerful than the papers themselves. A missing scroll is an open canvas and anyone can paint it with accusations. Mainstream fact again steadies us. Roman senators did keep proceedings in written form known as the Acta Senatus, and access to these was restricted. Over time, some emperors controlled how widely these records were copied or distributed. That control is no small matter. To decide who reads the words of the Senate is to decide who understands the workings of Rome itself. If a fire consumed part of that record, whether by accident or design, the loss would not just be bureaucratic, it would be political dynamite. Theories swirl like smoke. Perhaps the fire was orchestrated by senators who feared the exposure of their ancestors. Perhaps a current scandal was about to break wide open. Perhaps the emperor himself, whoever held power at the time, preferred a blank slate over a messy archive. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was an accident of oil lamps, dry scrolls, and bad luck. Scholars still shake their heads, unable to choose definitively. As the city settles back into its routines, the whispers do not fade. They grow fester and multiply. The archive is gone, but its imagined contents live on embroidered with every telling. Rome proves once more that absence breeds story faster than presence breeds certainty. The Curia's ashes lie black and silent, but the forbidden archives, real or not, now belong to memory, rumour and bedtime speculation. The morning after the fire, the Senate of Rome limps back to its duties, though duties might be too noble a word for the chaos that unfolds. The Curia lies gutted, its marble cracked and blackened, its roof collapsed into a jagged pile. Senators gather in makeshift halls or under porticos, their togas smelling faintly of smoke, no matter how much rose oil they dab at the folds. Their voices rise in anger, confusion, and suspicion. No one wants to admit weakness, but everyone knows that Rome's collective memory has been gutted like a fish. The scene is anything but orderly. Men who normally pride themselves on measured rhetoric now shout across benches, waving their arms like hawkers at a marketplace. One senator insists the vigils were bribed to arrive late. Another claims he saw mysterious figures carrying bundles out of the curia before the flames took hold. A third demands that every surviving record be catalogued immediately, though no one can agree on who should oversee such a monumental task. The word conspiracy hovers in the air like lingering smoke impossible to brush aside. Mainstream fact anchors this confusion. The Senate did indeed keep its proceedings recorded, the Acta Senatus, which emperors from Augustus onward restricted from public view. By the imperial period, the emperor himself often decided how widely the minutes of Senate meetings could be shared. That degree of control already bred tension. Now, with records reduced to ash, senators fear that control has slipped into silence. Historians still argue whether the Senate truly lost unique records in this fire or whether copies existed elsewhere. Yet to the men standing in the wreckage, the loss feels absolute, as though Rome itself has suffered amnesia. The chaos also exposes the fragility of authority. Senators who once strutted in dignity now jostle like children denied their toys. Some race to rescue their reputations, loudly declaring that nothing incriminating about them could have been in those archives. Others drop their voices to mutter accusations about rivals. A whisper here, a smirk there. Soon half the Senate is convinced the other half has engineered the blaze. Quirky tidbits spread quickly. One senator supposedly demanded an inquest into whether mice gnawed the scrolls, and caused sparks of theory as ridiculous as it is desperate. Another insists that divine lightning struck the curia in judgment, though no one recalls thunder that night. Imagine the physical setting: benches dragged into a portico, scribes balancing wax tablets on their knees, dust drifting down with every shuffle of sandals. Senators cough partly from smoke that still hangs in their lungs, partly from indignation. They argue over whether to rebuild the curia immediately or delay until they discover the truth. Of course, discovering the truth is a convenient way to stall decisions, because the truth has likely gone up with the parchment. Among the loudest debates is the matter of secrecy. If the forbidden archives held compromising evidence, then whoever arranged their destruction now controls the narrative. Rome's ruling class thrives on precedent, on quoting earlier decrees, on invoking past authority. Without written proof, debates collapse into he said, she said, though senators would never phrase it so plainly. To lose the ability to cite a document is to lose a weapon in political combat. In this moment, the Senate feels stripped not only of its building, but of its armour. One fringe tale insists that a handful of senators staged a chaotic scene deliberately. Supposedly, while the crowd focused on the flames, these men slipped out with select bundles of scrolls and hid them in private villas. Later gossip even named one villa on the Aventine Hill where suspiciously well-fed slaves were seen unloading charred bundles. Was this genuine theft, or just tavern talk? Historians still argue whether any secret library survived the fire. If so, it has never surfaced, though the thought of lost records tucked in an aristocrat's wine cellar is too tantalizing to dismiss. The emperor naturally cannot remain silent. When word reaches the Palatine Hill, he dispatches messengers to calm the city. Publicly, he blames misfortune, urging citizens not to listen to wild rumours. Privately, he may breathe easier, especially if those rumours held even a grain of truth. After all, what ruler does not benefit from wiping away embarrassing records? The duality, public reassurance, private relief hangs over the Senate like a shadow. In the chaos, practical matters stumble along. Clerks attempt to reconstruct inventories from memory. One man swears there were 300 amphorae of tax receipts. Another insists there were closer to 500. The difference of 200 amphorae each, holding 26 litres 7 gallons, is hardly trivial. That is thousands of litres, thousands of gallons of documentation now missing. When confronted, the clerks simply shrug. How do you argue about numbers when the evidence is dust? Meanwhile, the vigils, exhausted from their night of bucket lines, defend themselves against accusations of incompetence. They remind senators that their tools are limited, that no amount of water carried by men on foot could smother a fire that raced across scrolls stacked floor to ceiling. Each roll of papyrus might measure several meters, several feet long when unrolled. Imagine thousands of them drying like kindling, each one a fuse waiting to ignite. Blaming the vigils is convenient, but it hardly explains why the blaze began in the most sensitive chamber. Jokes too weave through the chaos because Romans could rarely resist humour even in crisis. One senator quips that the gods must have wanted to reduce the paperwork, saving Rome from death by bureaucracy. Another mutters that at least now they will not spend hours debating whether commas belong in decrees, a sentiment suspiciously modern in its complaint. Laughter bubbles up, nervous and short-lived, before fading into grim silence. As the day wears on, the Senate's chaos becomes ritual. Shouts, accusations, gestures, then silence when someone mentions divine judgment. The lack of clarity fuels the fire of paranoia more effectively than any torch. Senators realize that in the absence of records, memory itself becomes political currency. Who remembers what? Whose memory will be trusted? Whose version of events will become official history? The Curia may be gone, but the Senate's bickering ensures that the fire will not fade from Rome's mind. Instead, it transforms from disaster into mystery, from accident into intrigue. And in that transformation, the Senate loses more than scrolls, it loses certainty. Rome's memory, it also exposed the stark limits of Roman firefighting. To picture it clearly, one must set aside modern engines with flashing lights and high-pressure hoses. In Rome, the battle against fire was fought with buckets, ladders, hooks, and sheer human determination. And sometimes determination is no match for a roaring inferno. The Vigiles, Rome's official night watch and firefighting corps, numbered around 7,000 men, divided into cohorts across the city. They patrolled streets guarded against burglars, and when disaster struck, they shouldered the role of fire brigade. Their tools were simple but ingenious for their time. A leather bucket might hold about 10 litres, a little over 2.5 gallons of water. 2 men passing buckets along a line could move surprising amounts, but against a blaze consuming thousands of scrolls, each scroll essentially a tightly rolled wick, the water seemed to vanish into steam. Mainstream fact steadies us here. The Vigiles were founded by Emperor Augustus around the year 6 CE, after a series of catastrophic fires had embarrassed the city. They were armed not only with buckets, but also with siphones, hand-operated pumps capable of spraying jets of water. Yet these pumps had limited reach, perhaps only a few meters, a few feet hardly adequate when flames leapt from roof to roof like dancers. Historians still argue whether the technology allowed them to deliver sustained pressure, or whether the pumps sputtered after only a few minutes. Either way, the Senate's fire provided a brutal demonstration of their shortcomings. As the Curia burned, the Vigiles likely attempted the same strategy they used in crowded insulae, the tall apartment blocks. Notorious for combusting like torches, they created fire breaks. With iron hooks, they tore down adjacent wooden structures or ripped open burning walls to prevent the blaze from spreading. In a neighbourhood of tenements, such methods sometimes worked. In the heart of the Forum, with stone colonnades and massive wooden roof beams, the scale was different. Imagine men hacking at timbers thicker than their thighs, only to find sparks dancing faster than their axes. One quirky anecdote survives from later retellings. A watchman supposedly dragged a cat from the flames, cradling it like a child while ignoring shouts to save ledgers. The cat predictably repaid his heroism by scratching his face bloody. Another story tells of a fireman attempting to smother a burning pile of scrolls with a wool cloak, only to find the cloak catching first, then his sandal straps leaving him hopping in circles as his comrades cursed and laughed. These details may be exaggerated tavern humour, but they capture the impossible task men armed with fabric and water, against a blaze stoked by parchment, oil and timber. The limits of firefighting also stem from logistics. Water supply in Rome depended on aqueducts feeding fountains and cisterns. To fight the Senate fire, the Vigiles would have drawn water from the nearest basin, perhaps 100 metres, 328 feet away. Each sprint with a sloshing amphora might deliver 26 litres, 7 gallons, but the fire devoured that in seconds. Multiply that effort by dozens of men, and still the flames grew. Some estimates suggest the interior temperature of such fires could reach 600 degrees Celsius, about 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to warp bronze fixtures and crumble mortar. Against that kind of heat, men with buckets may as well be tossing teardrops into a volcano. Historians still debate whether negligence worsened the disaster. Did the Vigiles respond too slowly, lulled by routine, or was the fire so sudden and fierce that no response could have mattered? Later critics claimed that corruption weakened the corps men, accepting bribes to look the other way, officers more concerned with political favours than discipline. Yet even the most disciplined cohort would have been humbled by the blaze that night. Consider how fires behaved in Rome's urban jungle. Narrow streets funneled wind carrying embers from one roof to another. Wooden balconies jutted into alleys forming ladders for flame to climb. Once a fire began, it spread not in straight lines but in leaps, a maddening pattern that defied control. In the curia shelves of scrolls stood like stacked kindling. Each scroll rolled tightly burned from the edges inward, creating glowing coils that dropped embers onto lower stacks. The effect was like a cascade of torches, each igniting the next in ruthless succession. Romans had no protective gear. A fireman stepping too close risked hair singeing skin, blistering lungs searing from smoke. They tied cloth over their mouths, dampened tunics in cisterns, and hoped to last a few minutes longer. Imagine the coughing, the tears streaming down soot-streaked faces, the hoarse shouts of officers trying to impose order. Quirky as it sounds, some even used vinegar-soaked sponges as primitive filters, believing the acidity cut the smoke. Whether it helped or only made them smell like salad dressing is an open question. By dawn, the truth was plain. Rome's firefighting methods were heroic but limited. They could contain a kitchen blaze, perhaps prevent a street from disappearing, but they could not preserve the Senate's forbidden archives once the flames took hold. Senators surveying the ruins might curse the vigils, but deep down they knew that parchment oil lamps and timber roof beams had always been a recipe for disaster. And so, the limits of firefighting fed the mystery. If no mortal force could have saved the archives, was the fire fated? Did the gods decree that Rome should forget certain secrets? Or did human hands arrange circumstances knowing the vigils could never succeed? Each senator left the forum with that question smouldering in his mind. Rome had learned much about aqueducts, concrete and engineering marvels, but in the face of fire the empire still fought like villagers at a bucket line. The flames have died, the ashes cooled, and yet the real blaze now crackles in the minds of Rome's rulers. When the Senate gathers again this time in a temporary hall borrowed from a temple, the conversations are not about rebuilding stone or replacing scrolls. They are about motive. If the forbidden archives were destroyed, who stood to gain Rome has always been a city of suspicion, a hive where ambition hums louder than bees in a jar. And nothing feeds ambition like the disappearance of incriminating paper. The most obvious suspect whispered in corners and muttered in taverns is the emperor himself. Whether the ruler at the time was cautious paranoid or ruthlessly pragmatic, he certainly had much to gain from a clean slate. Rome's emperors inherited both glory and baggage, and some of that baggage lay written down in those archives. Imagine records of secret negotiations, concessions made under duress, or the names of noble families whose loyalty was less than ironclad. If you are an emperor eager to present yourself as divine and unshakable, those records are a thorn in your sandal. What easier way to remove the thorn than to let it burn? Historians still argue whether emperors directly ordered such destruction, or merely allowed fires to finish what they conveniently began. Mainstream fact steadies us again. Emperors such as Augustus and Tiberius strictly controlled access to the Acta Senatus, deciding who could copy or consult Senate records. This centralization of control demonstrates how valuable such texts were as tools of legitimacy. To silence them permanently through flame might have been an extreme but effective extension of that same impulse. But emperors are not the only suspects. Senators themselves, particularly those with skeletons rattling in their family cupboards, may have sighed with relief as smoke rose. Consider a senator whose grandfather had accepted bribes from Parthian envoys, or whose uncle had plotted against a previous emperor. If records of such treachery lay in the archive, every ambitious rival could weaponize them. The fire thus acted as a kind of political amnesty, wiping away sins with soot. The fact that some senators were seen rushing from the curia, clutching suspicious bundles, only fanned these suspicions. One quirky rumour insists a senator hid a bundle of scrolls beneath his toga and waddled like a goose down the steps, fooling no one. Generals, too, enter the circle of suspicion. Rome's military machine thrived on reports tallies of soldiers, lists of arms and supplies. If a general had inflated numbers to claim more pay or glory, the archive might hold the truth. Picture a commander boasting of leading 40,000 soldiers, when in reality he had only 30,000 men, about 66,000 pounds of grain, fewer needed to feed them each month. A scroll proving his deceit could ruin him. Better perhaps that such scrolls smoulder into silence. Then there are the cults and secret societies that flourished in the city's shadows. The cult of Mithras, the devotees of Cybele and countless others, existed uneasily beside Rome's official religion. Some senators accused these groups of subversion, whispering that they kept coded prophecies or strange rituals recorded in the archive as evidence. If such scrolls existed, the cults themselves would benefit from their destruction. A Mithric initiate might say the gods of light had sent the fire purifying lies. Cynics might reply that a torch slipped into the Curia's window achieved the same result. Historians still debate whether foreign enemies could have played a role. Rome was never free from spies. Parthian agents, Gallic malcontents, even disaffected provincials might have sought to cripple the empire by erasing knowledge. The idea of scrolls containing sensitive treaties or military strategies appeals to the imagination. If such documents were destroyed, an enemy abroad gained breathing room. If they were stolen before the blaze, an enemy gained intelligence. Either way, Rome lost. Practical citizens take a simpler view. The greatest beneficiary is not a person, but the city's gossip. In the absence of records, every tavern storyteller becomes a historian. Every rumour gains plausibility. The fire feeds conversation, and conversation feeds control. Whoever controls the narrative of the fire accident or conspiracy gains influence. One witty bystander remarked that Rome had traded scrolls for stories, and stories were harder to burn. Quirky tales sprout as quickly as mushrooms after rain. A slave claimed he saw a senator pour lamp oil deliberately onto a pile of scrolls, though when pressed, he admitted he had been several meters, several feet away and rather drunk. Another insisted that the gods themselves lit the fire, for he had seen a flame leap skyward in the shape of an eagle. Yet another joked that it was all the fault of the Senate's cooks who stored too many amphorae of garum, the pungent fish sauce that, if you have ever smelled it, could indeed make one believe in divine wrath. The political fallout is immediate. Accusations fly, alliances wobble, and every senator looks at his peers with narrowed eyes. The emperor, if he did not cause the fire, certainly capitalizes on it. He positions himself as the arbiter of memory, promising to restore order, to rebuild the Curia, to commission fresh records. Yet everyone knows that fresh records can be curated, edited, and manipulated. The past once written is fragile. Once burned, it can be rewritten. As the days stretch on, the question who stood to gain becomes less about discovering the truth and more about controlling the answer. Senators accuse rivals to weaken them. Generals mutter about spies to justify more troops. Cult members point to divine will. The emperor smiles, letting the suspicion swirl, because while senators quarrel and generals worry, he alone appears calm the eye of the storm. That appearance of calm is in itself a gain. In the end, perhaps the greatest beneficiary of the fire is not a man, but the very concept of power. The destruction proves that whoever controls archives controls history, and whoever controls history controls legitimacy. Rome's rulers, emperor-senators, generals alike understand this with bone-deep certainty. The flames devoured parchment, but what they left behind was the realization that the truth of the past is as combustible as the papyrus it is written on. The fire has left nothing but rubble, yet whispers crawl through the ruins like ants after a feast. Even as senators argue and citizens gawk, rumours rise of scrolls that vanished before the first beam cracked or the first ember sparked. These stories are persistent, slippery, and impossible to verify, which of course makes them irresistible. The missing scrolls become more talked about than the charred remains everyone can actually see. One story insists that the Forbidden Archive's most sensitive bundles were removed the very night of the fire. Witnesses claim they saw shadows moving through the Curia hours before the blaze figures, carrying chests too small for furniture, but too heavy for mere clothing. One clerk swore on his life that he counted 3 carts rolling down a side street toward the Aventine Hill, each groaning under loads that clattered like wood but weighed like stone. Historians still argue whether these were supply wagons or something altogether more secretive. Mainstream fact steadies us here. Roman records were often duplicated. Provincial governors sent copies of reports to Rome, and treaties might exist in more than one place. If scrolls were removed before the fire, they may have been duplicates stored elsewhere. Yet the persistent detail that they were hidden away, not simply preserved, hints at a deliberate act. Why hide documents unless someone feared discovery? Consider the contents that might have been spirited away. One rumour names financial ledgers recording vast transfers of grain. Each amphora might hold 26 litres, about 7 gallons, and Rome consumed millions of litres each year. A missing ledger could conceal shortages or reveal profiteering. Another tale speaks of military rosters, lists of legions stationed at the empire's edges. If those rolls were stolen, an enemy might learn that a supposedly 30,000 strong force was in reality 25,000 men, about 5,000 soldiers fewer, each needing about a kilogram or 2 pounds of grain daily. That knowledge would be worth more than gold to a rival power. Quirky tidbits attach themselves to the missing scrolls like burrs on a toga. A drunk mason at a tavern swears he saw a senator sprinting with a bundle of parchment under his arm only to trip and spill it into a fountain. The papers, half wet and half singed, were then scooped up by giggling children who ran off before anyone stopped them. Another story claims a slave found a scroll in the ashes days later, only to use it as kindling for his master's bathhouse brazier. Whether true or not, these anecdotes remind us that accidents, carelessness and comedy often shadow history's grandest mysteries. Some scholars suggest that the idea of missing scrolls is itself a product of human psychology. Faced with loss, people invent survival stories. If everything burned, then the tragedy feels total unbearable. But if something escaped, if just a handful of scrolls survived, then hope lingers. The narrative of theft or secret removal softens the blow, turning total destruction into partial mystery. Historians still argue whether any documents truly escaped, or whether all we have are coping tales spun by a traumatized city. Imagine the conversations in private villas. Senators lean close over wine, voices low, asking each other if they have heard of a surviving bundle. Perhaps they hope to buy it to protect themselves, or to use it against a rival. The black market of information hums invisibly, scrolls now more valuable than jewellery. If even one prophecy or confession escaped the flames, its holder controls a weapon sharper than any gladius. Mainstream fact once more libraries in the ancient world, sometimes relocated documents during renovations or threats. The Alexandrian library, for instance, was said to scatter scrolls to satellite collections. The Romans, too, occasionally moved archives for safekeeping. It is not impossible that bundles were out of the curia before the fire simply by coincidence. Yet coincidence rarely satisfies rumour, and so the idea hardens that someone somewhere holds Rome's secrets in a chest. One quirky twist suggests that scrolls did not simply vanish but travelled far. A merchant boasted that he bought a bundle of papyri from a mysterious stranger and carried them to Antioch, where they were later copied by scribes who thought them harmless. If true, perhaps fragments of the forbidden archives lie hidden not in Rome but scattered across the provinces, disguised as ordinary receipts or philosophical treatises. The thought that some provincial scholar once wrapped fish in a scrap of Senate record is both absurd and tantalizing. In the Forum, charred beams still lie across the ruins. Children climb them like playgrounds, daring each other to poke through the ash. Every now and then someone claims to have found a scrap half a line of Latin, a single name, a number. Each fragment fuels speculation. Was this part of a prophecy, a tax receipt, a letter naming traitors? The absence of context makes every shred important. In truth, most are probably meaningless, yet in the imagination they loom larger than life. And so the missing scrolls take on lives of their own. For some, they represent salvation, proof that not everything was lost. For others, they symbolize corruption, evidence that the guilty saved themselves, while the innocent lost their records. For the emperor, the very rumour is useful, for it keeps senators nervous and rivals guessing. Perhaps he knows the truth, perhaps not. But allowing suspicion to thrive is a political strategy in itself. By night the ruins fall silent, but the city hums with stories. The missing scrolls are now everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously burned, hidden, stolen and sold. They are ghosts of papyrus haunting Rome more effectively than any intact document could. And in this uncertainty power shifts, because whoever people believe holds those scrolls becomes dangerous regardless of whether the chest is real. The fire destroyed the Senate's forbidden archives, yet it also birthed a second archive, an archive of rumour, speculation and fear. This archive cannot be burned, for it lives in minds and mouths. And that perhaps is the greatest mystery of all, whether the missing scrolls existed at all, or whether they are a creation of Rome's need to believe that not even fire can consume every secret. The ruins of the Curia stand black and silent, yet they still speak, though faintly and only to those willing to listen. For generations after, the fire writers, chroniclers and amateur historians searched among the ashes of Rome's memory for any surviving trace. Sometimes they claimed to find fragments, a half-burned parchment, a tablet cracked but legible at the corners, a citation in a later work that hints at a lost source. These faint echoes form the closest thing we have to the forbidden archives. They are whispers in ruins, faint but persistent. One mainstream fact guides us: Roman historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio drew on senatorial records when composing their works. They often lament the gaps in their sources, acknowledging that entire stretches of history were difficult to reconstruct because documents had been lost or destroyed. This is not proof that the Curia's fire directly deprived them, but it demonstrates how fragile Rome's archival system was. The state kept meticulous records, but a single disaster could create holes wide enough to swallow decades. Historians still argue whether the Senate fire was one of the pivotal losses that forced later chroniclers to rely more heavily on rumour and oral testimony. Among the ruins themselves, scavengers picked through debris. Children played in the charred space, daring each other to dig with sticks. Occasionally someone would announce the discovery of a recognisable scrap, a name, a number, perhaps a phrase about treaties or taxes. One quirky tidbit tells of a boy who supposedly found the words grain ships on a scorched parchment, only to use it to wrap figs on his way home. If true Rome's great mystery was demoted to fruit packaging. Another tale describes a dog that padded through the ruins with a fragment clenched in its teeth, sparking a comic chase as scribes sprinted after it through the forum. The dog escaped, and whatever secrets it carried ended up chewed beyond recognition. Still, echoes survived in less dramatic ways. Later legal codes sometimes cite decrees whose originals no longer exist. A line preserved in the digest might trace back to a Senate decision whose parchment turned to ash. When we read those lines today, we hear faint notes from the vanished symphony. Similarly, inscriptions carved in stone occasionally preserve summaries of senatorial decrees. Imagine walking past a weathered slab in a provincial town and realizing it is quoting a decree once stored in the Forbidden Archive. The fire consumed parchment, but stone resisted. These echoes are scattered across the empire like fragments of a broken mirror. Speculation, of course, filled the void. Some scholars suggested that the loss of the archives explains why certain scandals survive only as rumour. For example, whispers about senators accepting bribes from Eastern kings persist in literary sources, but lack documentary confirmation. Did the fire erase the paperwork, leaving only gossip? Others argue that prophecies, if they existed, might have been quoted piecemeal in later works stripped of their context. Imagine a cryptic line like Rome's fall comes when water runs backward, appearing centuries later in a historian's flourish. Without the original scroll, we cannot tell if it was an authentic prophecy or an invention. Quirky rumours persisted about lost knowledge. Some Romans insisted the archives contained experimental recipes cement that hardened underwater, stronger even than what Roman builders already used, or formulas for purple dye less costly than the Tyrian mollusk. When fragments of unusual writing surfaced, hopeful citizens declared them proof of these secrets. A burnt tablet found in a dump was hailed as the recipe for indestructible walls, until someone pointed out it was just a contractor's grocery list. Even so, the idea that lost scrolls might have held technological marvels fed the imagination of poets and philosophers. Later historians often shook their heads at the gaps. Livy's monumental history, already incomplete by his death, suffers from stretches where sources ran thin. Was the fire partly to blame? Tacitus openly complains of lost records, acknowledging that he must rely on second-hand testimony. His careful skepticism suggests that he knew how easily stories warped without written anchors. Historians still argue whether his sharp tone was shaped by the memory of the Senate fire. Imagine a scholar in the 2nd century hunched over a wax tablet by lamplight, struggling to reconstruct events of the previous century. He sighs, mutters about gaps and scrawls. The records are missing. His frustration becomes our inheritance. Each time he laments a loss, we are hearing the echo of that fire centuries after the last ember cooled. In the ruins, rituals took place as well. Some Romans believed the fire was a message from the gods and treated the site with reverence. Offerings of wine and incense were left amid the rubble, as if coaxing the gods to restore memory. One quirky anecdote tells of a senator who buried a jar of honey in the ruins, claiming it would sweeten the gods' mood. Whether the gods appreciated sticky bribes is unclear, but the gesture reveals how Romans blended superstition with politics. The echoes extended beyond Rome. In distant provinces, governors puzzled over decrees they were meant to follow, but could not find in their archives. Letters from provincial officials occasionally mention confusion about legal precedents. Did the fire cause such uncertainty? It is difficult to prove, yet the timing suggests a connection. The empire was vast, and even small holes in the record rippled outward, unsettling bureaucrats thousands of kilometres, thousands of miles from the forum. In truth, the ruins spoke not in words, but in absences. Every missing scroll, every broken tablet, every reference in later texts reminded Romans that their memory was incomplete. And incomplete memory is fertile ground for invention. The echoes of the Curia fire are not clean syllables preserved in stone. They are the overlapping hum of rumour, speculation and longing. Centuries later, when archaeologists brush dust from fragments and historians pore over citations, they are still listening for those faint voices. Some swear they can almost hear them in the crackle of papyrus, the scrape of stylus on wax, the sigh of wind through ruined marble. The forbidden archives may be gone, but their echoes linger mocking us with the suggestion that Rome's deepest secrets are not lost, merely muffled. The ruins have cooled, but the fire lives on in whispers. Rome has never been short of conspiracy theories, and the destruction of the Senate's forbidden archives became fertile ground for every suspicion, rumour and political attack. In a city where ambition flows thicker than wine, it was almost inevitable that the blaze would be recast not as accident, but as plot. Some citizens believed divine anger had kindled the flames. Others insisted that human hands guided the torch. And as months passed, the debate shifted not to whether it was deliberate, but to which shadowy figure should be blamed. One of the most persistent conspiracies tied the fire to Emperor Nero. Even though historians still argue whether Nero was even alive when the Senate fire occurred, his reputation for torchlit theatrics and disastrous fires made him a natural villain. Later writers eager for dramatic flair folded the Senate blaze into the broader legend of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. The forbidden archives they claimed had contained evidence of his financial corruption, or of his dangerous fascination with prophecy. What better way to silence accusations than to let them vanish in flames? Mainstream fact provides context. Nero did oversee construction projects after the Great Fire of 64 CE, famously building his Domus Aurea, the Golden House. His association with fire was so strong that many later Romans attributed unrelated disasters to his supposed pyromania. Whether the Senate archives burned under his watch or earlier, his shadow loomed large. To accuse Nero of conspiracy was convenient, for his memory was already a bonfire of scandal. But Nero was not the only target. Other emperors, especially those known for paranoia, were accused of orchestrating the destruction. Tiberius, who exiled senators on flimsy charges, was rumoured to have ordered incriminating documents erased. Caligula, remembered for extravagance and cruelty, supposedly feared records of his humiliations. Domitian, with his obsession for control, may have seen the archives as a threat to his legacy. Each emperor's enemies painted him as the arsonist, fitting the fire neatly into their political propaganda. Historians still argue whether these accusations were sincere or simply slander. Beyond emperors, senators themselves were prime suspects. Conspiracy-minded citizens claim that a cabal of powerful men had arranged the blaze to destroy records of their corruption. One story accuses a group of wealthy patricians who feared exposure of tax evasion. Another suggests generals conspired, desperate to hide evidence that they had falsified legion numbers to claim greater glory and pay. Imagine scrolls revealing that a general boasted of 30,000 soldiers, when in truth he commanded 25,000 men, requiring about 10,000 fewer litres, or about 2,600 gallons of grain daily. If such fraud existed, those scrolls burning was a godsend. Quirky rumours grew stranger as time passed. One tale insisted that foreign cultists, worshippers of the goddess Cybele, had snuck into the Curia with torches to punish senators who mocked their rites. Another claimed Parthian spies bribed a guard to ignite the archives, ensuring Rome lost records of secret treaties. A particularly fanciful version even accused the Vestal Virgin's guardians of Rome's sacred flame of letting their eternal fire wander a bit too freely. Imagine accusing the empire's most respected priestesses of arson. It was slanderous, ridiculous, and yet repeated often enough to make tavern audiences roar with laughter. Conspiracies also found fertile ground in prophecy. Some Romans believed the archives contained Sibylline verses predicting Rome's doom. Conveniently, these prophecies were always said to have warned of a fire. Thus, when flames devoured the Curia, it was proof that the prophecy had been fulfilled, or that conspirators had staged the fire to make it so. Historians still argue whether prophecies were truly housed there, or whether desperate Romans retrofitted old verses to explain a present disaster. The longer the debate continued, the more each faction shaped the conspiracy to suit its needs. A senator accused of treason would claim his accuser had destroyed exonerating documents. An emperor defending his legitimacy might hint that rival families torched the archive to erase their shameful past. Conspiracies were weapons sharpened by suspicion and wielded without hesitation. Mainstream fact reminds us again, Rome was no stranger to fires. The city's dense wooden structures, open flames, and gusty winds ensured that accidental blazes were common. The vigiles existed precisely because fire was a recurring threat. Yet as modern readers know, when disaster strikes repeatedly, suspicion flourishes. Just as people today debate whether accidents are truly accidental, Romans refused to believe the Senate's forbidden archives vanished without intent. Quirky tidbits peppered the law. A satirist joked that the fire had been started by an accountant desperate to avoid balancing ledgers. Another claimed the gods themselves had grown tired of senators bickering and set the Curia alight for peace and quiet. Jests aside, these stories reveal the undercurrent of suspicion. When institutions lose trust, even jokes sound plausible. The conspiracies never reached consensus. Instead, they multiplied like sparks from a torch scattering into dry straw. For some, the emperor was guilty. For others, senators bore the blame. For still others, it was foreigners, cultists, or fate itself. Each theory said less about the fire and more about the fears of those telling it. The emperor's enemies saw imperial plots. Senators' rivals saw corruption. Citizens weary of decadence saw divine punishment. And perhaps that is the true power of conspiracy. It fills the vacuum left by burned records. Without parchment proof, imagination becomes evidence and rumour becomes archive. In Rome, where politics thrived on reputation, the absence of certainty was itself a weapon. Every whisper became a dagger, every suspicion a scar. The Senate's forbidden archives may have turned to ash, but the conspiracies they inspired burned longer than any parchment could. They lingered in speeches and tavern tales in the writings of later historians who could not resist repeating them. Even now, centuries later, we feel the heat of those suspicions still glowing faintly in the ruins of memory. The fire that consumed the Senate's forbidden archives left more than ruins and rumours. It carved a permanent scar into Rome's understanding of power. For in the empire's heart, among the charred stones of the Curia, leaders realised that memory itself could be controlled, reshaped, or obliterated. The blaze was not simply destruction. It was revelation. Rome had always known that power required soldiers, money, and spectacle. But now senators and emperors alike recognised a subtler truth. Control of the past meant control of the present. In a city that thrived on precedent, this was no small insight. Every debate in the Senate invoked earlier decrees. Every legal argument pointed to past cases. Every boast of lineage or honour was supported by written testimony. With the archives reduced to ash, these weapons dulled. The absence of records forced senators to argue not with documents, but with memory, and memory is pliable, bendable, and often treacherous. Historians still argue whether the fire permanently shifted Rome from a culture of written precedent toward a culture of political theatre. What is certain is that in the aftermath the spoken word carried new weight. Mainstream fact grounds this shift. Augustus and his successors carefully curated how the Acta Senatus were distributed, limiting public access. The Senate already knew that documents could be suppressed or revealed for advantage. But the fire made clear that suppression could become permanent, that an emperor or senator could literally erase the past. This lesson did not vanish with the smoke. It lingered, influencing how Rome's elite wielded history for centuries to come. Quirky anecdotes illustrate the change. One senator asked to prove his claim that a decree had once granted his family special privileges, waved dramatically at the ruins and declared the proof was there, but alas, the gods have eaten it. His rivals laughed, yet the claim went unchallenged, because who could prove otherwise? Another story tells of a general who, accused of exaggerating his victories, shrugged and said, "The archives would agree with me if they had survived." Such quips reveal how absence itself became a shield, turning loss into advantage. The lessons extended beyond individual convenience. Emperors saw opportunity in the blank slate. A ruler could now commission new archives emphasizing victories and glossing over defeats. Fresh decrees could be crafted with no fear of contradiction from older records. Imagine an emperor proclaiming that his dynasty had always enjoyed divine favour. Without incriminating scrolls to prove otherwise, the declaration could stand unchallenged. Control of memory became a new pillar of imperial authority. But this control was fragile, and everyone knew it. If archives could be erased, once they could be erased again. The people of Rome learned that their history was not indestructible stone, but fragile papyrus, as combustible as kindling. This realization created unease. Citizens whispered that nothing was safe, that any scandal might be quietly burned away. Some grew cynical, believing no record could be trusted unless carved into marble or inscribed on bronze. Others clung to oral traditions, memorizing events and passing them to their children like precious heirlooms. Historians still debate whether this cultural shift explains the growing appetite for monumental inscriptions in the imperial period. Triumphal, arches, victory columns, and dedicatory altars proliferated, each carved in stone. Was this Rome's answer to the fragility of parchment? Perhaps emperors and senators alike sought to anchor memory in more durable material, ensuring that their version of history outlived fire and conspiracy. The column of Trajan, rising meters over 100 feet into the sky, may be less about celebrating conquest than about securing memory in granite. Quirky theories flourished too. Some Romans claimed that the fire had been divine instruction, teaching them to carve their deeds in eternal stone rather than trust flimsy scrolls. Others joked that the gods were tired of reading paperwork and wanted shorter speeches. One wag in a tavern quipped that the fire was Rome's way of decluttering an ancient purge of outdated files. If the laughter was nervous, it was because everyone sensed the truth history could vanish overnight, and with it reputations, laws and legacies. The lesson was not lost on scholars either. Historians writing in the decades after the fire grew more cautious, more sceptical, more aware of the gaps in their sources. Tacitus, for example, frequently acknowledges missing records, lamenting the silences that prevent full certainty. His tone of suspicion may reflect not just personal temperament, but the culture born of archival loss. When the written word proves fragile, the historian's task becomes fraught with doubt. The fire also demonstrated that destruction could be as powerful as preservation. To save a scroll is to maintain continuity. To burn it is to create ambiguity. Ambiguity in politics is fertile soil for manipulation. A senator can plant whatever seed he wishes in that soil: accusations, exonerations, prophecies, or jokes. The loss of certainty gave rise to a theatre where power depended not on what was written, but on what could be convincingly spoken. Mainstream fact reappears here. Rome's bureaucracy remained vast and efficient in many ways. Taxes were collected, armies were supplied, laws enforced. Yet the fire's lesson lingered in the background like the smell of smoke in old cloth. Bureaucracy worked, but it was vulnerable. Leaders who understood this vulnerability could exploit it, while those who ignored it risked ruin. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of all was that memory is never neutral. The forbidden archives, whatever they contained, represented a version of Rome's past that some found inconvenient. Their destruction showed that history is not merely about truth, but about power. Control over what is remembered and what is forgotten became a silent battlefield, fought not with swords but with scrolls, and in this case with flames. And so, as senators squabbled and emperors schemed, Rome itself learned a dangerous wisdom that the past can be rewritten not by pen but by fire. The forbidden archives had vanished, but the lesson of their disappearance endured, etched into the consciousness of an empire that now understood how fragile and how valuable memory truly was. The Curia stands quiet, now rebuilt and respectable. Yet the memory of its burning still warms the marble like a lingering ember. People cross the forum and glance toward the place where smoke once climbed, and even if they do not speak, their shoulders tilt, their eyes flicker, and the story walks beside them. The ashes remember, Rome remembers, and the questions keep moving with the crowds: what burned, who benefited, and why did the city let a flame decide which parts of its life would be forgotten? Years slide past and the tale grows smoother in the mouth. Grandfathers tell it in courtyards while children chase each other around pillars. Market sellers fold it into gossip alongside the day's prices. Veterans lean on staffs and nod as if they were there even when birthdays prove they were not. The fire becomes a soft coin rubbed by too many hands, the details worn but the outline intact, a night of orange light. A roar like surf, a house of law and memory cracking when heat prays joints apart and rafters give way. Mainstream fact anchors the legend. Fires plague Rome across centuries, and the vigils founded under Augustus patrol at night pump water and tear down burning walls with hooks. Stone monuments multiply as the empire matures, as if rulers collectively decide that words chiselled into marble endure better than words painted on papyrus. Inscriptions rise along roads, on arches and on columns that tower roughly 30 metres, about 98 feet into the sky. Historians still argue whether the Senate fire nudges this instinct along, or whether the trend grows from other needs, but the result is plain: what must outlast ashes carved in stone. Citizens adapt. Scribes keep duplicate sets of minutes in safer rooms. Senators memorize speeches with priest-like care. Clerks copy important decrees onto bronze tablets and deposit them in temples where flames are watched by professionals. A few wealthy families, unwilling to trust the state again, make private archives. Their librarians walk the shelves like gardeners, pruning, watering, and sometimes transplanting troublesome texts. A practical joke spreads that the surest way to erase a debt is to shelve it beside a lamp. The second surest way is to claim the receipt burned in a famous fire. Emperors learn. Whoever rules the city understands that memory is a lever. He orders victories carved in stone, titles etched in letters as tall as a man's forearm because stone resists rain, mould and accidents. He funds a new archive, appoints stricter guardians and lectures senators on careful lamp use, though everyone notices how readily he quotes the missing documents when they would have helped his enemies. The lesson is too useful to ignore. Control the record and you control what people think happened. Control what people think happened and you control the future they will accept. Meanwhile, ordinary life folds the tale into its fabric. A baker tells his apprentice that the smell of burnt flour is nothing compared to the curia. The apprentice nods solemnly, absorbing a memory he never lived. A mosaicist sets tesserae in a bathhouse and hides a tiny red square in one corner. A spark no bather will notice, a private salute to the night when the city glowed. A mother hushes a child with the sentence, "Sleep now, the fire is out." The sentence works, though the child quietly wonders whether any fire ever fully goes out if people keep telling stories about it. Mainstream fact steadies the mood again. Some decrees survive in quotations preserved by later jurists and chroniclers, and inscriptions across the provinces still echo decisions first debated in the Senate. The past is not a black wall. It is more like a wall painted again and again, with earlier colours peeking through where plaster chips away. Even so, the gaps remain. Historians still argue whether crucial scandals vanish in the blaze names of conspirators, numbers in tax ledgers, admissions written in a trembling hand, or whether later writers exaggerate the loss to dramatise their books. The ashes also teach an unsettling elegance absence can be pressed into service. A senator accused of corruption raises his hands and sighs that the exonerating scroll is gone. His rival does the same and sighs that proof of guilt has evaporated. In this new theatre, the winner is not the man with the better document, but the calmer voice, the steadier gaze, the line most audiences prefer. Rome slides almost imperceptibly from arguing with documents to arguing with performances. The city that loves law begins to applaud confidence, as if confidence were evidence. What then do the ashes remember? They remember a danger older than emperors, that a city made of words must guard the places where words sleep. They remember that power grows when memory can be pruned and shaped, and that power holding a lamp is more dangerous than power holding a sword. They remember that truth, which likes to think of itself as stone, is sometimes only paper in a dry room. And they remember too how human the city is, how its people laugh even when anxious, how they joke that the gods started the blaze just to shorten Senate meetings, how they insist the smell of smoke makes wine taste better, though that last claim is bravely optimistic. The debate never settles. Historians still argue whether the blaze is accident, omen or plot. Some nights it looks like negligence, a lamp too near a shelf. Some nights it looks like policy, a torch carried by a man who knows exactly which cabinet to visit. Some nights it looks like fate, an empire reminded that nothing here lasts forever. The curia today is orderly, the records crisp, the lamps carefully trimmed, but the lesson stands in the doorway like a sentry who never sleeps, reminding the city that paper burns faster than pride. So Rome walks on past the square where senators once gather, past basilicas and arches that catch late light like honey, past vendors who call out weights and measures loaves by the kilogram, by the pound, wine by the litre, by the gallon, distances by the kilometre, by the mile. People still glance toward that corner. The marble keeps its secret. The city remembers. You drifting toward rest remember too. And if the ashes could speak, they would say only this: keep the lamps trimmed, copy your records twice, and tell your children that memory is a building, beautiful, useful and flammable. Then they would fall quiet again, comfortable as warm sand, content to let the questions breathe for another night. And now, dear listener, the flames at last begin to fade. The streets of Rome grow quiet, the echo of sandals on stone softening into silence. The curia is dark, its ruins bathed not in firelight, but in moonlight, gentle and silver. Where once sparks leapt into the night, now only fireflies drift, their tiny lamps blinking like distant memories. Take a slow breath. Imagine the smell of smoke replaced by the cool scent of marble after rain. The voices of arguing senators fade, replaced by the calm hush of wind threading through colonnades. The city rests, and so may you. The ashes remind us that nothing is permanent, yet in that impermanence lies a strange comfort. Scrolls burn, buildings collapse, but stories endure, stories retold softly, reshaped by each voice that carries them forward. Perhaps tonight you carry the story with you, not as a burden, but as a whisper, reminding you that even great empires are fragile, and that fragility is part of their beauty. Let your mind ease now. Picture the Forum empty its vast stones cooling under the night sky. Picture the stars above eternal watchers blinking patiently as centuries slip past. The fire is gone, the fear is gone, the noise is gone. Only stillness remains stretching outward like an endless horizon. Sink into that stillness. Let your breath slow, your eyes grow heavy. The story has reached its end, but its calm lingers like embers glowing softly in the hearth. And as you drift, may you feel the weight of history lift gently away, leaving only peace. If thoughts wander, let them pass like clouds over the Tiber, slow and harmless. Draw the blanket closer, feel its gentle weight, and let your shoulders soften. Sleep comes kindly to careful hearts,